Tell me about yourself. Go. Now, don't pretend you don't love being asked this in a job interview. In this video, we're going to be talking about the best answer to tell me about yourself and some of the things that you should never ever say. And we're going to decode this question. Why are recruiters asking it? What are they hoping to get? And what's going on behind the scenes? Let's dive in. Okay, this question, tell me about yourself. Usually it's an icebreaker. They ask this to you when you first get into the room and you sit down at the table to do the job interview. This is usually some way of getting some kind of conversation or interaction going in the beginning. And as a result, you don't want to spend too much time on it, okay? The second thing is that this is such an insultingly and infuriatingly general question. I mean, is it possible to get a more general question than this? I suppose they could ask you, tell me a random thing. That would be a general question. But only slightly less general is this. Tell me something about you, right? Now, how do you answer? Do you tell them your height, your weight, and your food dislikes? Would that be a good answer? Probably not, right? Here's what's going on. Okay, now, if you've done a job interview before, you probably are aware that it's possible to meet all the technical requirements for the job as listed in the job posting under requirements, but still not get the job, right? There's obviously more going on than simply meeting the posted job requirements. There's obviously other things they're looking for that they're not explicitly telling you about. And that's where this question fits in, okay? Now, let's step back for a second, okay? Let's step back. A couple of things here. What is your purpose in a job interview? I'll tell you what your purpose is. Your purpose is to communicate your value to the interviewer. Now, more specifically, what do you mean by value? Well, they're looking for certain things. Certain things have been stated explicitly in the job posting. Certain things are kept hidden, right? You don't know what are the hidden things they're looking for, but you do know what they have explicitly said we are looking for, okay? So let's step back a second. What is your purpose in the job interview? Well, the big one is to communicate your value and how you meet all the job requirements that they've said. Now, if you didn't meet those, okay, if you didn't meet enough of them for it to make sense, they wouldn't have called you in for the interview. So you don't have to be afraid of doing this, okay? That is, after all, why you're there. You're not at the job interview to talk about something you did 10 years ago at a different company that has nothing to do with this job, nothing to do with this role, and all it does is it takes up time, okay? That's the thing. We got to stay on task. Now, that's the other reason why when we answer, tell me about yourself, we don't want it to go on for very long. We don't want to give a very long answer here. It's general. We don't know what they're probing for. And it's an icebreaker. It just serves to get the conversation started. What we want is to get past this question so that they can be much more specific in the things that they're asking us about. And then we know what we're doing. We know what to say. Okay, that's the first point to remember. Second point to remember. Once again, let's step back for a second. Okay, what has happened in the process up to now? Well, we sent in our job application, usually with our resume attached. And upon receiving and presumably reading our resume, what did they do? Did they eliminate us? No. They invited us in for an interview. So what's the conclusion? The material that's on the resume is safe. None of that material was considered a red flag. None of that material was considered insufficient to investigate you further. So this is the material we're going to fall back on when we have no idea what they're probing for. It's just that simple. Okay, now let's combine some of these into an answer, okay? If they ask you in a job interview, tell me about yourself, especially if it's right at the beginning of the interview, a great answer that tends to work really, really well is to start by saying, well, as you can see from my resume, just like that. Well, as you can see from my resume, and then you go down your resume and summarize it in reverse chronological order. Usually you start off with your education, and then you do your work experience starting from your oldest stuff to your latest, okay? Now, you're wanting to summarize it briefly. You don't want to spend a lot of time here. okay? Because we're still at the icebreaker. So this whole thing should ideally take somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45 seconds. That's the amount of time that you talk for. You don't want to talk for more than this because you want to keep more of your talking time for demonstrating how you meet the requirements and how you have value, okay? So that's what you do, and you conclude with the phrase, and that's what brings me here today and why I'm excited to learn more about this opportunity. Okay? That's a great answer. Now let's dive in. Okay. Some people will ask, well, what if they're already familiar with your resume? Well, I say, great. That's great. They should be familiar with your resume. A lot of recruiters are actually not. They have scanned your resume back when they invited you for an interview, but that could have been weeks ago. A lot of times, in my experience, recruiters do not have that much time to scan and revise resumes immediately before job interviews. Sometimes it happens. There are some good recruiters out there that do this, but most of the time they don't. And a lot of people will attest to the fact that when they get to the job interview, the recruiter is actually unfamiliar with their background. And so when they ask this question, it serves to inform the recruiter and give them a little bit of a crash course of who you are, so then they can ask more intelligent questions afterwards, okay? Now, if they are familiar with your resume, that's great. They wanted to know about you, and what you did is you gave them the most fundamental, relevant information about you to start the interview. And that's a great way to start. A lot of times, some recruiters will have very specific things in mind when they ask this question, and they'll make it an impossible guessing game. They'll say, tell me about yourself, and then you answer, and they'll say, well, no, I wanted to hear about your interests. Now, that is unanswerable, okay? Most candidates are not mind readers, and if you were the most intuitive person in the world, you would still have a problem with this kind of guessing game, okay? An answer I've heard a lot is to say, talk about your personality, talk about your interests, talk about your hobbies, talk about your ambitions, talk about, your future plans or something like that. I would say no, don't do any of that. That's very dangerous to do because once again, we don't know what constitutes their hidden elimination criteria. Like the sports team example. I've seen this with my own eyes. I've seen a candidate eliminated in a job interview because they said that they supported a certain sports team. And unbeknownst to that candidate, the hiring manager supported the opposing sports team. And the hiring manager had determined that, it's probably going to be hard having a very good working relationship with this person, knowing that they're rooting for the opposing team to what I am. And so based on that, I'm going to eliminate them. I've seen this. That's an extreme example, but we do get this a lot, okay? We get all kinds of hidden elimination criteria that are red flags that you know nothing about. So when you're asked this question, without knowing what direction the conversation is going to go in and what they're looking for, the best thing to do in the icebreaker is to stick to your safe material. Okay? And that way, the conversation can take many different directions afterwards. They can ask you about accomplishments. They can ask you about specific jobs. They can ask you about skills and experience. It can go wherever they want. Okay? Now, there's one point I want to make, and that is that the first phrase of the answer that I recommend, which is, as you can see from my resume, that's more of a memory jog for you, okay? If you really feel uncomfortable saying that, you can eliminate that phrase. It's more of just to set the sort of stage for what you're going to say next, okay? A lot of times it depends on how you say it. You don't want to say it in a condescending way. Well, as you can see from my resume, I've done this, right? You don't want to do that. But if you are unable to do it subtly, just eliminate the phrase. That's fine. It's more of a memory jog. Okay. Now, if you do encounter an interviewer that will rake you over the coals for not reading their mind and giving them specific information about something they were thinking of, like your personality or interests or ambitions or your family or your home situation, or any of that stuff that, you were supposed to somehow read into it. A great way to challenge that is to basically say, certainly, what would you like to know? If they say, no, I was asking you about your interests, you say, certainly, what would you like to know? Right? And you let them be more specific. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. This is a very common question that I get. It's probably the number one most requested question that people have on my YouTube channel. How do you answer this question? Hopefully that makes sense to you. Thank you very much for watching. You guys are awesome, and I will see you soon. Take care.